What's going on, folks? Ted from Nerd Immersion here, and I'm going to talk to you today about 10 pretty significant, or I guess 10 spell updates slash changes that are worth noting in the 2024 Player's Handbook. Now, a couple of things. First of all, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, consider doing so. It's a simple click, means a lot to me. Two, I feel like I've pretty much hit a lot of the major things that have been kind of called out, or that I've noticed that other folks seem to have noticed, as well as the weird interactions of different aspects of things within the 2024 Player's Handbook, like rules wise. I'm not saying there isn't more that we haven't met or come across, but I think a lot of the other ones that have been kind of called out are those tied to the spells. So we're basically done kind of covering the wonkiness of the interactions of different mechanics. We're going to go over this. I've got around, I think, almost 40 spells that I think are definitely worth checking out because they have different aspects that have changed them in such a way. Some are pretty significant changes, others are just relatively minor overall. So that being said, we're going to do these 10 spells here, but after this, we're basically, we'll intermingle the other spell videos, but we're going to kind of move on to more class coverage as well as species and feats and things like that. So that'll be coming in the near future as well. Also be on the lookout, I think tomorrow, I'm not sure when, you're maybe later today by the time you're watching this, I will be launching that Player's Handbook giveaway. So anyway, number one, first one, or number 10, depending on how you want to count down here, is Armor of Agathys. Now, this spell isn't really different except for one. Actually, it is different, right? It's a bonus action now. That's a big change, right? It is now a bonus action to activate Armor of Agathys. That's a pretty significant improvement, in my opinion. It gets a lot more usage out of playing it there. Also, as we talked about with the concept of casting things with spell slots versus not spell slots in that previous video, if you have a means of casting Armor of Agathys without a spell slot, you could do that on your turn as a bonus action and then still do something with an action, or vice versa, depending on how you want to go about that. But the thing that a lot of people have called out, and I've seen it countless times in the comments, is the way things are worded now. It seems like if you were to go and look up Armor of Agathys as it stands currently in the 2014 version, it has specific wording that, again, seems to have been removed, possibly on purpose. It previously stated that, if a creature, you get 5 temporary hit points, which is what happens now. If a creature hits you with a melee attack when you have these hit points, the creature takes 5 cold damage. It now states you gain 5 temporary hit points if they hit you with a melee attack roll before the spell ends, which is a 1-hour duration. You take 5 cold damage, or they take 5 cold damage. It ends early if you have no temporary hit points. What a lot of people are keying in, and maybe this will get cleared up in a sage advice or an errata, or maybe you'll just make your ruling based on this now. What a lot of people are going on and suggesting is it says if you have no temporary hit points, whereas the previous version said if you have these hit points, referencing the hit points tied to Armor of Agathys, the spell itself. Based on what I'm reading and based on the general consensus of people about this version of the spell, as long as you have temporary hit points and are within the 1-hour duration and they haven't been depleted, you should still be affected by Armor of Agathys. There are other means. So reminder that temporary hit points don't stack, right? That's the big one. You replace. So let's say I have my 5 temporary hit points from Armor of Agathys, and I have a means of getting 20 temporary hit points in some other way. I could choose to have the 5 temporary hit points from Armor of Agathys or the 20 from this other means. So I would normally say, well, let me take the 20, and because it's a bigger number and you want more hit points, right? But the previous wording again says while you have these hit points, again, so the way it would work is if you took 5, if you have 5 temporary hit points and you took 1 point of damage, they'd take 5 points, you'd still have 4 temporary hit points, right? That's how that works. The way they're referencing it here now is that if you have any temporary hit points, as long as the temporary hit points you have don't go to 0, thus ending the spell, that should allow Armor of Agathys to stay up on you, is what people are kind of getting to. And I kind of I fall in that camp. I think that's how it's written. Again, it's one of these instances where a couple of words have been removed and it could open things up. But also, it's Armor of Agathys, right? They gotta hit you first with a melee attack, right? Which is part of it. So you gotta find yourself in a situation where you're in melee. So it's situational. And like, there's not a lot of ways to get like a ton of temporary hit points. Yes, like power word fortify gives you like 100 temporary hit points or whatever it turns out to be. That's really cool. Are you going to use power word fortify on yourself to get the extra little bit of damage you might get from Armor of Agathys? Now, again, there are some classes, like for example, if you have this typically on a warlock, right? If the warlock has the false life based invocation where they basically just get the maximum amount of hit points from false life, that I think ends up to be somewhere around 13 hit points that you could just re-up every turn essentially. So you could get more that way. And it's also nice that you, as long as you have it, right? I mean, again, it starts off at 5. Most warlocks are probably going to cast this at 25 hit points when they get to maximum 5th level spells for their spell slots. So it's not like a huge thing, but it's something a lot of people have focused on. They're like, oh, it's so much better now. And yes, in theory, it is better. The bonus action alone makes it a better spell overall. But if it truly works as people are thinking, and I do think is the intention, as long as you have temporary hit points and those temporary hit points never hit 0, the spell remains. Again, it is only an hour duration, but this allows you to possibly juice yourself up with some temp HP. And then that way, like if you're, oh, I only have a couple hit points left from Armor of Agathys and it's about to drop, and you could re-up temporary hit points from some other means, you can extend the life of your Armor of Agathys. All right, next up, this one, pretty simple here, but it's an interesting change, is suggestion. Now, suggestion here works almost identically in every possible way to the existing version of suggestion, with one kind of interesting, again, another word removal. So if you're taking a look at that, the original wording was, you suggest a course of activity, magically influence them. The suggestion must be worded in, this is the original wording from 2014. The suggestion must be worded in such a manner as to make the course of action sound reasonable. The reasonable aspect has been removed from the current wording. So it says the suggestion must sound achievable and not involve anything that would obviously deal damage to a target or its allies. That's basically it. So nothing too crazy on this one. Obviously, there still doesn't work if they're immune to the charm condition. But it must continue for the entire duration, etc. So it's not like a huge change, but it just says it's worded that it has to be achievable. And if we're going to argue the pedantry of singular words appearing, the suggestion being achievable is very different than the suggestion being reasonable. Now, obviously, it says you still can't do things where you're going to force them to cause damage and blah, 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 whatever it might be. But is it something that can be achieved? Yes or no? Is very different than, does the character you're casting suggestion on find it reasonable? Right? So one thing that a lot of people will often say is they'll use suggestion. They'll say, hey, you walk that way for 8 hours, because that's the normal duration of suggestion, right? If I tell you to just pick up whatever you're doing and walk 8 hours in that direction, walk 8 hours due east, that's achievable. You can do that. You can walk 8 hours due east. Is it reasonable? Probably not. Therefore, depending on how the DM looks at it from 2014, if I tell you go walk that way for 8 hours, the DM could be like, well, that's not reasonable. Maybe they'll walk for a little while and then they'll stop. But it is definitely an achievable thing. You can do that. So, again, argue amongst yourselves in the comments, but that's one to consider as well. All right, next up, a nice quality of life here for Aura of Vitality. Not my favorite spell, but when you have access to it, it's nice. In the past, it required you to use your bonus action to activate the healing, which was kind of a bummer. So basically, you would activate it as an action, and then on the turn you activate it, and every subsequent turn for a minute, you would have to burn your bonus action to heal 2d6 hit points. So even if the turn you cast it, you would basically spend your action and a bonus action to activate it. Now, when you create the aura as part of the creation of it, and just at the start of your turn, you can choose a creature to heal, which is so much nicer than blowing your bonus action. Like, again, the turn you cast it, it's basically your whole turn would be action, bonus action to get a little bit of healing. This now is just, it happens, and then at the start of your turn, you can say, yep, you get 2d6 hit points. So much cleaner, so much more useful in the long term. Again, typically, it is a paladin only spell for the most part. Not always, but it's designed initially to be a paladin only spell. So this could potentially be something you want to keep up, especially now. And I'm wondering if part of the reason why it changed is because the current wording now has you blowing your bonus action to do smites. So perhaps that led to the adjustment of the way Aura Vitality works. So that way you're not having competing versus smite. But that's fine. It's a general update and improvement to the spell, so I like it. Now, this next one is, I'm a little shocked to see it because it's just improved in so many ways, and that is Ray of Sickness, a spell that is often not, I feel like often forgotten or unused because of the fact that, one, it's poison damage, right? And poison damage is highly resisted. But now, previously, it was they take 2d8 poison damage if you hit them with a ranged spell attack, and then they have to make a Constitution saving throw. If they fail, they're poisoned until the end of your next turn. Now, they're just poisoned, no save at all. So if you hit them with Ray of Sickness and they can be affected by poison, they are just poisoned. No save whatsoever. So I really like this change because I've mentioned this before. I like making attack rolls with spells because I feel like my fate is in my own hand. If I roll well, then I did that. If I roll poorly, well, that's on me. Whereas if it's something that requires a saving throw, then it's like, I don't really know. Not that I'm thinking my DMs are cheating or fudging dice rolls, but I don't know what they rolled. I'm just giving you a number and you're trying to beat it when I want to be the one to try to hit you. But yeah, now Ray of Sickness just grants auto no save poison condition, drastically improving the usage of this spell, assuming again you can fight things that aren't immune to poison, which several things are, at least in 2014. Who knows what we'll see come 2024 Monster Manual. Next one up here is Grease, and the age-old question has officially been answered. Grease is non-flammable, at least in 2024 anyway. The first word there says non-flammable grease covers the ground. This was a common thing, and we'd see it all the time in Baldur's Gate 2, right? You cast, or Baldur's Gate 3 as well. You would cast grease to put a flammable surface on the ground and hit it with a fireball to set it on fire and deal burning damage over time and maybe cause an explosion. Now, official ruling in 2024 is the grease created by the grease spell is non-magical. Simple improvement here and a great quality of life is Lesser Restoration is now a bonus action. Again, it may cure less things than it did previously. I think Lesser Restoration used to cure disease, but it looks like basically, I think diseases may have been removed from the game entirely. A lot of the functionality that provided stuff. No, I guess it's it says one condition or a disease. I think diseases have basically, that's my assumption based on a lot of things that used to interact with disease seem to be gone, like paladins no longer have immunity to disease and things like that. But blinded, deafened, paralyzed, or poisoned, great to see Lesser Restoration becoming a bonus action. It allows you to do other things on your turn. Big fan of that. All right. Another one that had a drastic overhaul that is a completely different spell in my mind, and rightfully so, is Sleep. Sleep had this funky mechanic, and I think it may have, I don't remember if this was a holdover from older editions or not, but basically you are rolling a bunch of dice to try to hit a hit point total, and then the number of hit points you hit would reduce that. If you had like two goblins with each had 5 HP and you rolled more than 10 on your 5d8, they'd both fall asleep. That has since been changed to now be a 60-foot radius sphere, or 60-foot radius. Each creature of your choice in a 5-foot radius sphere centered on a point within that 60-foot range must make a wisdom saving throw. If they fail, they have the incapacitated condition until the end of their next turn, at which point they get to repeat the save. If the target fails the second save, they are now unconscious for the duration. The spell ends on a target if it takes damage or someone shakes it awake. And then again, creatures that have immunity to sleep or immunity to exhaustion, automatically succeed on this save. This is a massive improvement. You'll see, I'm not going to really, I don't know if I'm going to cover it in a future one, but Color Spray had a similar change, right? Color Spray, I think, also used to be a dice pool. And if you rolled high enough on the dice pool, you would have blind that many creatures. This is a massive improvement for Sleep, in my opinion. I think the radius of it may have changed. It used to be, I think, a lot bigger than a 5-foot radius. It was originally a 20-foot radius, but now it is, and it used to be 90 feet. Now it is 60 feet in a 5-foot radius, but it's much more targetable. And now those creatures, again, fail the first save, they're incapacitated. Fail the second save, they're unconscious. A lot easier to understand. The only difference is Sleep previously was one of those situations, as I was just talking about, where you're kind of taking your fate into your own hands. You're rolling the 5d8. You're trying to hit the big numbers. Whereas now the new version of Sleep, it's a save DC. However, it also does not have an upcast, where previously the upcast would add additional dice for the dice pool. So that's fine. I like the adjustments to Sleep. Now, this next one is going to be one that I'm sure many of you saw coming. We've seen it once before, and it wasn't a huge win for a lot of folks. People were really upset. That is Counterspell. It is basically the Unearthed Arcana version that we saw. You attempt to interrupt a creature that's casting a spell. It makes a Constitution saving throw now. On a failure, the spell dissipates with no effect, and the action, bonus action, or reaction used to cast it was wasted. If that spell is cast with a spell slot, the slot isn't expended. And again, it specifically states that you see them casting a spell with verbal, somatic, or material components, meaning that if it is a spell that doesn't have any of those, or they have a means of ignoring all of those components, you can't counterspell it. But I think another thing to point out, and kind of in favor of our conversation about you can only cast one spell with a slot per turn, Counterspell is specifically worded that if that spell uses a spell slot, the spell slot is not expended. However, if you're casting a spell somehow without a spell slot, whatever the means of you doing that, that is expended. So it's unfortunate, but I also understand the concept. It seems like a lot of this stuff, and I've seen it even in the comments, that like things that kind of like remove player agency of like shutting you down on a turn, like allowing incapacitated or stunned creatures to move. This might be another one of those scenarios where people are like, oh man, I was going to use my 7th level spell to teleport us, and I lost my 7th level slot, and we didn't get to teleport. Now Counterspell is more of like a minor inconvenience, and it delays the action of whatever you want to have happen. So yeah, I'm going to cast Teleport on my turn. You Counterspell me, I fail my saving throw. Okay, I still have my spell slot. I could try it again next turn, and then the limitation becomes how many slots do you have to attempt to counterspell me. It also lessens the need for counterspelling a counterspell, right? Where you kind of have counterspell. I'll counterspell your counterspell. It's like, okay, unless it's absolutely critical that the thing happens this turn, I'm basically just getting a delay of game, and I'll try it again next turn, essentially. I think Counterspell, obviously, no way around it. This is definitely a huge nerf to Counterspell. And Well, I could definitely understand why some players wouldn't want the old version of Counterspell because of the DM being able to use that version of Counterspell against them. I have had a lot of epic moments at the table where a party member counterspells an enemy spell or counterspells an enemy's counterspell. I was playing a campaign where we had 2 wizards and a warlock. So counterspells flew pretty heavily amongst the 3 of us. And it was also kind of nice because in that party composition, we would never, like, if somebody was trying to counterspell us, our thing would go off because we had so many people on our team to chain that counterspell, which I liked. Again, it's not for everybody, and I understand it definitely can bog and slow down play, but I enjoyed it. So it's a bummer to see it change. Does it work relatively? I mean, you're ultimately stopping the spell, but you're not losing the slot. So I don't know. That is Counterspell. Now, next up here is Summon Undead. This is another one of these instances where it's like, was this intentional? So most of what happens with Summon Undead appears to be the same, but the big one is normally if you go to Summon Undead, you have to choose either Ghostly, Putrid, or Skeletal are the types, right? Do you want to summon a ghost, a zombie, or a skeleton, essentially? Previously, the Undead Spirit had an ability, the Putrid version, had a Rotting Claw ability, which was, the target takes damage and it increases with the spell level used to cast it. If the target is poisoned, it must succeed on a Constitution saving throw against your spell save DC or be paralyzed until the end of its next turn. It also had an aura, a putrid, a festering aura that like people who would come into the aura would need to make a Constitution saving throw or risk being poisoned. And then again, if it hit you with the claw while you're poisoned, or if you're poisoned from the aura and it hits you with the claw, you have to make a Constitution saving throw or be paralyzed. Well, now, no save. If you're poisoned and it hits you with the claw, instant paralysis, no save. Let that sink in. If the target has the poisoned condition, it has the paralyzed condition until the end of its next turn. So if your undead spirit can hit somebody and they're poisoned with if it hit them with the rotting claw, auto paralysis. Previously, again, it was a save, a Constitution save. And I'd like to point out a spell we mentioned earlier, our good friend Ray of Sickness. If I hit you with a Ray of Sickness, that and you're not immune to poison, you are now poisoned, no saving throw. And if I have Summon Undead and my undead spirit hits you while you have that poison condition with its rotting claw, you are now paralyzed, no save. Was this intentional? There are other things in the player's handbook as well that also have these opportunities to do things. I think whatever the Fey spirit is basically has like a instant fear, no saving throw. I think the Quasits or the Imps, one of their poison is a poison, no saving throw. In theory, this is a lot cooler because you're going to get to do the cool thing you want to do more often. And I actually really like that, like, a Ray of Sickness is a necromancy spell. It's not a super heavily used spell currently, but now if you're comboing it with Summon Undead, the putrid version of Undead Spirit, that's a solid combo. I'll hit you with Ray of Sickness, and then the spirit will come after you because it's a reminder that it shares your initiative count, but it takes its turn immediately after you. It obeys your verbal commands. So you could summon your undead spirit or have it around because the undead spirit lasts for an hour. Get into combat, fire off your Ray of Sickness, hit somebody. If they're not immune to poison, they're now poisoned, and then send the undead spirit in right after you to then try to hit it with the rotting claw and possibly get insta paralysis. So, as I said, there are other combos in the game that kind of do this where it's just an instant success now where previously it was a saving throw. I'm all for these, but I also am wondering if we're going to see monsters with similar abilities that are just instant, you are now paralyzed, you are now poisoned. And if that's the case, then I'm even more for it because it's a balance thing, right? I don't know. This one's going to be pretty divisive, I think, because of the fact that there are, again, a handful of different ways to auto-inflict conditions with no saving throw. And lastly, we have, could we get a bigger kick in the pants to the Ranger? Paladin's Divine Favor spell, which is a bonus action to cast, is not concentration anymore. So Paladins can, as a bonus action, activate Divine Favor, which gives them an extra d4 radiant damage on all attacks they deal with a weapon. All attacks they deal with a weapon, mind you, ranged and melee, and it just does an extra d4 radiant damage every time, and that is not concentration. So that's something you have right out the gate. You could be doing that with smites, not concentration. And then when you hit to level 11 and get whatever it is, Blessed Strikes or whatever it's called, you just get to add an extra d8 radiant damage to all of your strikes all the time, period. So you could combo Divine Favor with that when you hit a higher level and basically be rolling whatever your weapon damage is, plus an additional d8 radiant damage, plus a d4 radiant damage every time you attack without concentration. So there you go, folks. That is 10 spells in the D&D 2024 Player's Handbook that I think are pretty interesting to see their changes. Like I said, I've got about another 30 or so spells that I think are pretty interesting, with a variety, again, of some of these being pretty massive changes, drastically changing the way the spell works, to minor changes shifting to action or bonus action or not concentration, or on the unfortunate effect of spiritual weapon becoming concentration. So anyway, let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. I'll see you all next time.